My sister smirked as the host led her family to the reserved table, casually blocking my path with her designer purse. "There is only room for 4, she announced, watching my 7-year-old son's face drop in confusion. Her husband shoved a crumpled $50 bill into my chest, telling me to go buy us some fast food since we did not belong at a Michelin star restaurant anyway. I did not cry or cause a scene. I just smiled, took my son's hand, and walked away. 10 minutes later, I was sipping vintage wine in the owner's suite, directly above them, preparing to drop a $10,000 trap on the very table they stole. I am Hannah, 33 years old, and I spent my entire life being treated like a second-class citizen by the people who shared my blood. Before I dive into exactly how I made my arrogant brother-in-law sweat through his custom-tailored suit, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to teach toxic relatives a lesson they will never forget. The Obsidian was the kind of restaurant that required a reservation 6 months in advance. Located in the heart of Manhattan, it boasted 3 Michelin stars and a waiting list filled with celebrities and Wall Street elites. I had booked a table for 6 half a year ago, intending to treat my parents, my sister Brittany, and her husband DeAndre to a nice dinner to celebrate my son Leo's 7th birthday. I wanted to do something special, something that proved I could provide a beautiful experience for my family. I should have known that in my family, my generosity would only be used as a weapon against me. Leo and I arrived at the restaurant exactly at 7 o'clock. He was wearing a tiny suit, his hair neatly combed, practically buzzing with excitement. We stood at the host stand waiting for the rest of the family to arrive. The mahogany walls and crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow, but the atmosphere turned freezing cold the moment Brittany and DeAndre walked through the heavy glass doors with their 2 children. My parents, Carol and Thomas, were conspicuously absent. "Where are Mom and Dad?" I asked, adjusting Leo's collar. Brittany, who was 36 but still acted like an entitled high school mean girl, did not even look at me. She marched straight up to the host stand. "Reservation for Adam," she said, using our maiden name, which the table was booked under. The host, a polished man in a pristine uniform, looked at his screen. "Yes, a table for 6. Right this way." Before I could step forward, Brittany turned to me and held up a manicured hand. "Actually, Hannah, there is a slight change of plans. Mom and Dad decided to stay back at the hotel. They said DeAndre needed to celebrate his big deal at work, so we are taking your spot. There is only room for 4 at the table now." I stared at her, genuinely stunned by the sheer audacity. "You are hijacking my reservation?" I asked, keeping my voice low to avoid a scene. "I booked this table 6 months ago for Leo's birthday." DeAndre stepped forward, his tall, imposing frame blocking the light. My African-American brother-in-law was a vice president at a mid-tier financial firm, and he suffered from a severe case of imposter syndrome disguised as extreme arrogance. He loved to flaunt his supposed wealth, always talking down to me because I wore simple clothes and drove a practical car. He did not know what I actually did for a living, and I had never bothered to correct his assumption that I was just a struggling single mother doing freelance work. "Listen to your sister, Hannah," DeAndre said, adjusting his overly flashy gold watch. "I just closed a major portfolio. I need to celebrate in an environment that matches my tax bracket. Mom and Dad agreed that this table is better suited for us. You and the kid would just feel out of place here anyway." The casual cruelty in his voice made my blood boil. It was the same dynamic I had endured my whole life. Brittany was the golden child, the one whose life was perfect, whose marriage was a shining beacon of success. My parents worshipped DeAndre because he drove a leased Porsche and bought them expensive gifts on credit. They always enabled Brittany's worst behavior, constantly sacrificing my feelings to protect her fragile ego. "But we came to eat the fancy food," Mom, Leo whispered, tugging at my sleeve. His lower lip was trembling, and that was the exact moment the final string of my patience snapped. I looked down at my beautiful, innocent son, who was being pushed aside by his own aunt and uncle. Brittany rolled her eyes at Leo's distress. "Do not be dramatic," she sighed. Mom told me to tell you that you need to learn to yield to family priorities. DeAndre is providing for our future. You are just trying to play pretend in a rich person's playground." DeAndre chuckled, a deep, condescending sound that echoed in the quiet lobby. He reached into his designer wallet, pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, and shoved it against my chest. "Here," he said, his tone dripping with pity. "Take the kid to McDonald's down the street. Get him a Happy Meal. It is more your speed anyway. Do not stress yourself out trying to fit in where you do not belong." The host stood there looking incredibly uncomfortable, unsure of how to handle the family dispute. He glanced at me, waiting for me to cause a scene, to yell, to demand my table back. That was exactly what Brittany and DeAndre wanted. They wanted me to look crazy, to look jealous and bitter. They wanted the satisfaction of watching security escort the poor emotional sister out of the luxury establishment. But I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not even refuse the $50 bill. I took the crumpled money from his hand, carefully smoothing it out. I looked at DeAndre's smug face, then at Brittany's triumphant smirk. I knew something they did not know. I knew that DeAndre's credit cards were maxed out. I knew that his supposed wealth was a house of cards ready to collapse. And most importantly, I knew exactly who owned the ground they were standing on. I crouched down to Leo's level and looked him directly in the eyes. "We do not cry over people who do not know our worth," I told him softly, making sure my sister and brother-in-law could hear every word. "We are going to go sit somewhere much, much better." I stood back up, offering them a smile that was pure, absolute ice. I looked DeAndre dead in the eye and said, "Enjoy the table, DeAndre. Make sure you order the absolute best. You deserve it." I turned my back on them and walked away, holding Leo's hand securely in mine. I could feel their smug satisfaction burning holes into my back as the host led them into the main dining room. They thought they had won. They thought they had put me in my place. But as I walked past the front doors and headed straight toward the private velvet-roped staircase at the back of the lobby, the real game was just beginning. I guided Leo away from the main dining room entrance, but instead of heading toward the heavy glass exit doors leading out to the street, I turned sharply to the right. Tucked away behind a grand pillar of solid black marble was a curved, softly lit staircase, cordoned off by a thick crimson velvet rope. A polished brass sign stood next to it reading "Private Access Only." As I unhooked the velvet rope and gestured for my son to step through, the young host from the front desk came rushing over. His previously polished demeanor was instantly replaced by outright panic. "Ma'am, excuse me," he called out, his voice sharp enough to draw curious glances from nearby patrons waiting for their tables. "You cannot go up there. That area is strictly off limits to the public. I need you to step back behind the rope immediately." I did not flinch. I did not argue. I did not even turn to look at him. I simply kept my hand resting lightly on the cool brass railing and waited. From the shadows of the adjacent hallway emerged Dominic, the general manager of the Obsidian. Dominic was an absolute legend in the New York culinary scene, a man who commanded absolute respect with just his physical presence. He possessed a sharp, calculating gaze that missed nothing. He saw the young host reaching out, preparing to physically grab my arm to stop me from ascending the stairs. Dominic did not shout. He did not cause a scene. He simply cleared his throat and shot the host a glare so profoundly terrifying that the young man froze completely in his tracks. The host looked at Dominic, then back at me, the color rapidly draining from his face as he realized he was about to physically assault the woman who signed his paychecks. "Step away from her," Dominic commanded quietly. His voice carried the lethal quiet weight of an executioner. "Apologize, and return to your station immediately." The host stammered a terrified apology, bowing his head before practically sprinting back to the lobby podium. Dominic turned his attention to me, his stern features melting into an expression of utmost professional respect. "Welcome back, madam," he said softly, bowing slightly. "I deeply apologize for the confusion. The front staff was not informed you would be utilizing the suite this evening. Right this way." Dominic unhooked the secondary security rope and personally led us up the softly illuminated staircase. With every step we took away from the main floor, the chaotic noise of the bustling restaurant faded into a muted, elegant hum. Below us, the main dining room was a vibrant theater of status, wealth, and endless pretense. Through the intricate ironwork of the balcony overlooking the floor, I caught a clear glimpse of table 4. Brittany was already snapping her fingers at a passing waiter, pointing aggressively at her empty water glass, while adjusting her hair for a selfie. DeAndre was leaning far back in his chair, his suit jacket unbuttoned loudly, boasting to the sommelier about his preference for expensive vintage champagne. They were trying so hard to project massive wealth, practically shouting to the entire room that they belonged there. It was the desperate, hollow performance of people who measured their entire self-worth by the price tags they could not actually afford. They were putting on a show for strangers, unaware that the real audience was watching from directly above. We reached the top of the stairs and Dominic unlocked the heavy oak door leading into the owner's suite. The space was breathtaking. Enclosed entirely by soundproof one-way observation glass, the suite hung suspended over the main dining room like a hidden command center. From here, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire restaurant, including table 4 directly below us, yet absolutely no one downstairs could see inside. The room was furnished in deep leather, rich velvet, and imported marble. A private dining table sat in the center, already impeccably set with the finest crystal and silver. Dominic pulled out a plush chair for Leo, who climbed into it with wide, amazed eyes, taking in the spectacular view of the dining room below. "Shall I have the kitchen prepare the usual for the young gentleman?" Dominic asked, his tone perfectly warm and accommodating. "Chicken tenders with the truffle fries," Leo chimed in, happily swinging his legs back and forth. "Exactly," I said, taking my seat opposite my son. "And Dominic, please bring me a glass of the vintage Pinot Noir. Take your time. We are going to be here for quite a while." Dominic nodded, his sharp eyes flicking briefly toward the glass floor overlooking my sister's table. "Very well, madam. I will ensure you have absolute privacy." He exited the room, closing the heavy oak door with a solid, satisfying click. Leo leaned his elbows on the polished marble table, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "Mom?" he asked quietly. "Why did not we just sit with Aunt Brittany and Uncle DeAndre down there? Did we do something wrong?" I looked at my son, seeing the lingering hurt in his innocent eyes. This was the exact moment I needed to break the generational curse of our family. I needed to teach him the lesson my parents had actively tried to beat out of me. I reached across the table and took his small hands in mine. "We did absolutely nothing wrong, Leo," I said, my voice steady and fiercely gentle. "But I need you to learn something very important tonight. In life, some people will try to make you feel small so that they can feel big. They will try to push you out of your own seat just to prove they have the power to do it." Leo listened intently, his eyes locked on mine. "So what do we do?" he asked. "We never beg for a seat at a table where we are not respected," I told him, squeezing his hands. "We do not cry and we do not fight them for scraps. We simply walk away and build our own table, a better table. You never have to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's narrow world. You know your worth, and you never let anyone, not even family, hand you a $50 bill and tell you to disappear." A slow, understanding smile spread across Leo's face. "Like how we got this super cool secret room instead." Exactly like that, I smiled back, feeling a profound sense of pride. We do not settle for less than we deserve. Just as I let go of his hands to pick up my cloth napkin, a sharp, aggressive vibration broke the peaceful silence of the suite. My phone was lighting up on the table, buzzing relentlessly against the marble surface. I glanced down at the screen. The notification banner displayed the name of our family group chat. The digital warfare had officially begun. I picked up the phone. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of notifications, all stemming from the family group chat named Family First. The irony of that title had never been more suffocating. My mother, Carol, was the first to launch her digital strike. Her message appeared as a solid block of furious text, completely ignoring the fact that I had just been displaced in front of my child. "Hannah, what on earth is wrong with you?" Carol wrote. "I just got a frantic call from Brittany. She said you threw an absolute fit in the lobby and tried to publicly embarrass DeAndre right in front of the restaurant staff. You know perfectly well how hard he works and how much pressure he is under right now with his new promotion. Why must you always make everything about yourself? Could you not just be a supportive sister for one single night?" I stared at the glowing screen. Threw a fit. Embarrassed DeAndre. My mother had masterfully twisted the narrative in a matter of minutes, taking the reality of my silent, dignified exit and warping it into an erratic, jealous meltdown. This was her specialty. She was a master architect of gaslighting, always rearranging the facts until I somehow became the villain of my own life. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of my mother's message, my phone vibrated violently in my hand again. This time it was my father, Thomas. He rarely engaged in the group chat unless he felt the need to drop the ultimate hammer of authority. His text was shorter, but it carried the heavy, unmistakable weight of an ultimatum. "Your behavior tonight is completely unacceptable," Hannah Thomas wrote. "DeAndre is providing a lavish lifestyle for your sister, and he deserves our utmost respect. If you cannot learn to put your petty jealousy aside and treat your family properly, then your mother and I will have to seriously reconsider whether we want you at Thanksgiving this year. We will not tolerate this kind of toxic energy around the grandchildren. Apologize to DeAndre immediately." The threat was laid out in plain text. Apologize to the man who just shoved a crumpled $50 bill into my chest or face. Complete excommunication from the family holidays. For 33 years, that exact threat had been their sharpest weapon. They knew how much I craved their approval, how desperately I wanted Leo to have a normal relationship with his grandparents. They had weaponized my desire for a cohesive family against me time and time again. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. My heart pounded against my ribs, a familiar, frantic rhythm of pure, unadulterated outrage. The injustice of it all burned like acid in my throat. I tapped the screen and began to type. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard with furious speed, pouring decades of suppressed anger into a massive emotional paragraph. I typed about how I had made the reservation 6 months ago. I typed about how it was Leo's 7th birthday, and they had not even bothered to wish him well. I typed about the sheer humiliation of standing in the lobby while DeAndre treated me like a beggar. I demanded to know why Brittany's fabricated comfort always mattered more than my basic human dignity. I asked why they were so fiercely protective of a man who constantly disrespected their own daughter. I poured every ounce of my hurt, my betrayal, and my exhaustion into that text box. It was a magnificent, heartbreaking defense. It laid out every fact, every logical argument, and every emotional wound. I stared at the blinking cursor at the end of the giant block of text. My finger hovered over the blue send button. But then I looked across the quiet, luxurious space of the owner's suite. I looked at Leo, who was happily munching on a perfectly crisp truffle fry, completely unbothered by the toxicity swirling inside my phone. He was safe. He was respected. He was sitting in the best room in the entire building. A sudden, crystal-clear realization washed over me, chilling my anger into absolute ice. If I hit send, I would be playing exactly the role they wanted me to play. I would be the defensive, emotional, hysterical sister. They would read my long, heartfelt message and laugh. They would show it to DeAndre as proof that I was jealous and unhinged. They would dissect my pain and use it as entertainment over their expensive appetizers. Arguing with them was just another way of begging for their understanding, and I had promised myself I would never beg them for anything again. They did not want the truth. They wanted a reaction. Slowly, deliberately, I pressed the backspace key. I held it down and watched as the massive paragraph vanished letter by letter, word by word, sentence by sentence. I watched my defense, my anger, and my desperate need for their validation disappear into the blank white void of the screen. The feeling of releasing that burden was intoxicating. It was the most profound sensation of power I had ever experienced. I did not need to explain myself. I did not need to defend my reality against their delusions. I owned the board we were playing on. With a calm, steady hand, I typed a completely different response. 5 simple words that offered zero ammunition, zero emotion, and absolutely zero surrender. No worries. Have a great dinner. I hit send. I set my phone face down on the cool marble table and picked up my glass of Pinot Noir. Through the soundproof glass floor beneath my feet, I looked directly down at table 4. I watched as Brittany's phone lit up with my message. I saw her snatch it up off the white tablecloth, her brow furrowing as she read my incredibly brief response. She showed the screen to DeAndre. He threw his head back and laughed, waving his hand dismissively before gesturing to the waiter for water. Brittany leaned back in her chair, a wide, triumphant smirk spreading across her perfectly contoured face. She tapped a quick reply, probably mocking my retreat, entirely convinced that she had crushed me. She thought I had folded. She thought I was retreating to my small, quiet life to lick my wounds in shame. The digital silence from my phone confirmed they had accepted my surrender. They would enjoy their appetizers, their expensive entrees, and their decadent desserts, completely shielded by their own arrogance. But the higher they climbed in their performance of wealth, the further they would inevitably fall. She had absolutely no idea that she was sitting perfectly still in the center of a trap I had just activated. I watched the soft glow of Brittany's smartphone screen illuminate her face from the dining room floor beneath me. The trap was officially set, but for it to work perfectly, I needed them to walk willingly into its deepest corner. I did not have to wait long. My phone, resting on the marble table next to my wine glass, buzzed with a new notification. Then it buzzed again. And again. I picked it up and opened Instagram. Brittany had wasted zero time launching her digital victory lap. The first post was a meticulously staged photo of her hand resting on top of DeAndre's arm, her diamond ring positioned to catch the ambient lighting of the restaurant. The caption read, "Spontaneous date night at the Obsidian." When your husband closes a massive deal, he treats his queen exactly how she deserves to be treated. So proud of my finance king. She tagged DeAndre, added a string of crown emojis, and made sure to tag the restaurant's location so everyone in her social circle would know exactly how exclusive her Tuesday night was. A second notification popped up. This one was sent directly to our family group chat. It was a video of DeAndre playfully tossing his napkin onto his lap while a waiter poured them sparkling water. My mother immediately replied with clapping hands and a message that read, "You two look absolutely stunning. Enjoy the fruits of your hard work. DeAndre is a true provider." I took a slow sip of my Pinot Noir, savoring the rich, complex flavor. A true provider. The phrase echoed in my mind, dripping with heavy irony. DeAndre was a vice president at a mid-tier financial firm, a title that sounded incredibly prestigious to my parents, but essentially meant he was a glorified middle manager scrambling to meet quarterly quotas. I knew exactly what his base salary was. I also knew that the designer suits, the leased luxury cars, and the constant need to present an image of boundless wealth had drained his bank accounts completely dry. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own vanity, pulling my sister down with him. And Brittany, utterly obsessed with outshining everyone else in our social circle, was perfectly content to drown as long as she looked fabulous doing it. The heavy oak door of the suite clicked open, breaking my train of thought. Dominic stepped inside, his posture impeccably straight, holding a sleek silver tablet. He approached my table with the quiet grace of a man who had spent decades navigating the volatile egos of New York's elite. "Excuse the interruption," Madame Dominic said softly, placing the tablet on the marble surface so it faced me. "I thought you might wish to monitor the progression of Table 4. As per your standard protocol for the owner's suite, this is the live point of sale feed for their tab." I glanced down at the screen. The Obsidian utilized a highly sophisticated digital ticketing system. Every time a waiter entered an order into their handheld device, it updated instantly on the master terminal. Right now, the screen displayed a rapidly growing list of items. "They have bypassed the standard tasting menu." Dominic noted, his tone entirely neutral. "The gentleman explicitly requested our premium a la carte options. He has already ordered the imported Wagyu beef tartare, the white truffle risotto, and 2 orders of the butter-poached lobster for their children." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The lobster for the children. Leo and I had planned to share a simple steak and some fries. Brittany and DeAndre were ordering food that their kids would likely push around on their plates and refuse to eat. But it was not about the food. It was about the performance. They are ordering like they just hit the lottery, I murmured, trailing my finger down the digital list. The current total was already approaching $800, and they had not even received their appetizers yet. It is quite a robust selection, Dominic agreed diplomatically. If I may ask, madam, the reservation remains secured under your personal platinum card. The standard policy for this tier of booking is to automatically charge the card on file for the final folio, unless the guest presents an alternative payment method at the conclusion of the meal. Given the circumstances of their seating, do they assume your card will absorb this evening's expenses? I looked up at Dominic, a cold realization settling over me. That was exactly what they assumed. When I originally booked the table 6 months ago, I had cheerfully mentioned in the family group chat that dinner was entirely on me. I wanted to treat them. DeAndre and Brittany had hijacked the table, kicked me out of my own celebration, but they still fully expected my credit card to foot the bill. They believed they had successfully bullied me into the shadows, leaving my wallet behind for their personal use. It was a level of entitlement so profound it bordered on delusional. Let them assume whatever they wish for now. Dominic, I instructed, leaning back in my plush chair. I want them to feel completely uninhibited. Treat them like absolute royalty. Whenever his glass is half empty, fill it. Whenever she looks around, have a server at her elbow. Give them the billionaire experience they are so desperately trying to project. Understood, madam. Dominic's eyes gleamed with quiet comprehension. He tapped the screen to refresh the feed. Oh, it appears the gentleman has just requested the sommelier. I turned my attention back to the glass floor. Down in the dining room, DeAndre was waving his hand with exaggerated authority, beckoning the head sommelier over to their table. I could not hear his voice through the soundproof glass, but his body language spoke volumes. He was leaning back, gesturing broadly, dismissing the leather-bound wine list the sommelier attempted to hand him. He wanted to make a statement. He wanted everyone in his immediate vicinity to know that he did not need to check prices. On the tablet in front of me, the screen blinked. A new item populated at the very top of their live tab. Chateau Margaux Premier Grand Cru Class. I stared at the screen, my breath catching slightly in my throat. I knew that bottle. It was one of the rarest, most highly sought-after vintages in the restaurant's exclusive cellar. It was not a wine you ordered casually on a Tuesday night. It was a wine you ordered when you were trying to prove you owned the world. Dominic looked at the tablet, his impeccably calm demeanor fracturing for just a fraction of a second. Madam, he said, his voice dropping an octave. The gentleman has just ordered the 1990 Chateau Margaux. The price for that specific bottle is $6,000. I looked down at DeAndre. He was grinning widely, saying something to Brittany that made her giggle and clap her hands together. They were entirely submerged in their golden delusion, wrapped in a fantasy of wealth, funded by the very sister they had just humiliated. Dominic took a step closer to my table, his posture tightening with urgent professional concern. He looked from the staggering number on the screen directly into my eyes. Shall I inform them of the price, ma'am? No, Dominic, I said softly, my eyes fixed firmly on the spectacle unfolding on the dining room floor below. Do not inform them of the price, not a single word. Dominic paused. His posture remained impeccably straight, but I could see the slight hesitation in his eyes. As a world-class general manager, he was highly trained to protect patrons from their own financial hubris. He was used to intervening with a polite, discreet whisper when a guest unknowingly selected a bottle of wine that cost more than a used car. But tonight was fundamentally different. Tonight, the usual rules of high-end hospitality did not apply to that specific table. Let him have exactly what he asked for, I instructed, taking a slow, measured sip of my wine. If a man demands to be treated like an absolute king, it is our duty to provide him with the full, crushing weight of the crown. Dominic simply bowed his head, a silent acknowledgement of my absolute authority, and stepped back into the shadows of the private suite. At that exact moment, my phone illuminated the dark marble surface of my table. It was not another notification from the chaotic family group chat. It was a direct, private text message from DeAndre. I slowly picked up the sleek device, feeling the cold metal against my palm. I swiped the screen open to read his words. Don't be bitter, Hannah. This dinner costs more than you make in 6 months. People like us belong here. People like you don't. Go enjoy your fast food. I sat perfectly still, reading those 4 sentences over and over again. The raw, unfiltered audacity of his message was almost breathtaking. It was a masterclass in psychological projection and deep-seated insecurity. DeAndre was staring up at the ceiling of a restaurant he could never afford to buy, texting insults to the woman who literally owned the foundation beneath his feet. He was so blinded by his own desperate need for superiority that he could not see the reality of his own pathetic situation. I analyzed his words, breaking down the miserable truth behind his finance bro facade. People like us belong here. I knew exactly what kind of people DeAndre and Brittany were. They were the architects of a massive, crumbling financial illusion. In my position at the top of the hospitality and private equity food chain, I dealt with actual billionaires on a daily basis. True wealth always whispers. It wears unbranded cashmere, drives practical luxury vehicles, and never feels the desperate need to announce its presence to strangers. Fake wealth, however, screams at the top of its lungs. DeAndre was screaming. Behind the leased luxury cars, the perfectly tailored suits bought on revolving credit, and the arrogant swagger, DeAndre was actively drowning. His mid-tier vice president's salary was entirely consumed by the crushing pressure to maintain this elite masquerade for my parents and his peers. I knew for a fact that his credit utilization was pushed to the absolute limit. He lived paycheck to paycheck, terrified that one bad quarter or one missed performance bonus would bring his entire fragile empire crashing down. He masked his profound financial panic by degrading anyone he perceived as weaker. Today, that chosen target was me and my 7-year-old son. He genuinely believed my quiet lifestyle was a clear symptom of poverty. He looked at my lack of flashy jewelry and my total refusal to engage in our family's toxic boasting contests as absolute proof of my failure. He needed me to be a failure so he could feel like a success. He needed to banish me from an exclusive restaurant to convince himself that he actually belonged there. I set the phone back down on the table. A profound, icy calm settled deep into my bones. The anger that had been simmering in my chest entirely evaporated, replaced by a razor-sharp strategic clarity. The era of playing the accommodating passive sister was officially over. If DeAndre wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial domination, I was more than willing to step onto the court. But I was not going to play by his rules. I was going to rewrite the entire system. I gestured for Dominic, who immediately stepped forward from the periphery of the suite. He approached my table, the silver point-of-sale tablet still held securely in his hands. The $6,000 bottle of Chateau Margaux hovered on the screen in digital purgatory, waiting for the final overriding authorization from the owner. Dominic. I said, my voice ringing with crisp, absolute authority. Proceed with the wine service for table 4. Bring them the Chateau Margaux. Present it with all the customary ceremony. Decant it, pour it, and let them toast to their phenomenal success. Give them the most spectacular service this restaurant has ever provided. Certainly, Madam, Dominic replied, tapping the screen to finalize the exorbitant order. The item locked into their rapidly escalating tab. But before you send the sommelier down there, I continued, holding his gaze steadily. We need to make a slight administrative adjustment to their reservation. Hand me the tablet. Dominic placed the device on the table directly in front of me. I logged into the master administrative backend of the restaurant's financial software. I navigated past the floor plan and directly into the highly secure billing profile for table 4. Right there, securing the reservation, was my personal platinum card. Brittany and DeAndre were carelessly ordering thousands of dollars of vintage wine and imported caviar under the arrogant, delusional assumption that my card would automatically absorb the entire devastating blow at the end of the night. They believed they had successfully bullied me into the shadows, leaving my wallet behind for their personal use. With a single deliberate tap of my finger, I deleted my credit card from the system. The reservation was now completely unattached to any safety net. The financial trap was perfectly primed. I handed the tablet back to Dominic. I have removed my payment authorization from their file. I told him, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. When they finish their spectacular meal and request the check, do not allow them to charge it to the room or leave an open tab. Present them with the physical bill. Let them face the absolute exact cost of their massive arrogance. Dominic stood frozen for a fraction of a second, absorbing the immense weight of my directive. He looked down at the tablet, his fingers hovering over the polished glass screen. In any normal circumstance, detaching a guaranteed payment method from a table actively ordering vintage multi-thousand-dollar wine would trigger a massive internal security alert. High-end dining establishments like the Obsidian operated on airtight financial protocols to prevent dine and dash scenarios or fraudulent charges. To remove the primary funding source, mid-service required an override that surpassed even the general manager's authority. Madame Dominic said, his voice dropping to a cautious, almost conspiratorial whisper. The system requires an executive biometric master authorization to completely wipe the primary ledger while the table is holding an active high-tier balance. The financial software will not let me proceed without the ultimate administrative clearance. I nodded, fully aware of the strict digital safeguards in place. I pulled my phone back toward me and opened the encrypted authentication application I used for all my high-level corporate transactions. This was the exact moment the massive unbridgeable chasm between my family's delusion and my actual reality became glaringly obvious. For the past decade, my parents, my sister Brittany, and my arrogant brother-in-law DeAndre had comfortably categorized me as the struggling, invisible sister. They saw my practical clothing, my quiet demeanor, and my deliberate refusal to engage in their exhausting, flashy status games as absolute proof of my failure. They thought I scraped by on meager freelance gigs, pinching pennies to raise Leo on my own. They loved that narrative. It made them feel superior. It allowed DeAndre to puff out his chest and offer me a crumpled $50 bill as an act of humiliating charity. What they absolutely failed to realize was that while they were busy maxing out credit cards to buy designer logos, I was busy buying entire corporations. I am not a struggling single mother clinging to the fringes of their fabricated high society. I am the managing partner of Apex Hospitality, one of the most ruthless and successful private equity firms on the Eastern Seaboard. I specialize in the acquisition, restructuring, and total financial domination of elite food and beverage establishments. While DeAndre was sweating over middle management performance reviews just to keep his leased Porsche, I was quietly executing 9-figure buyouts across Manhattan. My family never knew because I never told them. Early on, I realized that sharing my success with people who actively wanted to see me fail was a dangerous game. If they knew the truth, my parents would have relentlessly demanded money to fund Brittany's lavish lifestyle. They would have leveraged my assets to cover DeAndre's mounting debts and claimed my corporate achievements as their own personal parenting victories. So I built my empire entirely in the shadows. I embraced the philosophy of stealth wealth. I drove a safe, reliable car and lived in a highly secure, beautifully understated brownstone. I never flashed my bank statements, and I never corrected their insulting assumptions. I let them underestimate me because being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage a person can possess in business and in life. 3 weeks ago, Apex Hospitality finalized a massive, highly aggressive acquisition deal. We bought out the failing parent group that previously managed this very restaurant. We cleared their massive debts, restructured their entire management hierarchy, and injected millions into their operational budget to elevate their Michelin status. I did not just book a reservation at the Obsidian. I literally own the building. I own the imported Italian marble beneath DeAndre's expensive polished shoes. I own the crystal chandeliers hanging over Brittany's perfectly contoured face. I own the exclusive wine cellar where that $6,000 bottle of Chateau Margaux was carefully stored. Every single waiter, chef, host, and manager in this building answers directly to my executive board. The sheer beautiful irony of the situation washed over me like a cold winter wave. DeAndre had stood in the lobby of my own restaurant, looking down his nose at me, telling me I did not belong in a place like this. He had arrogantly declared that people like him were meant for the elite world, while people like me should retreat to the nearest fast food drive-thru. He was putting on a pathetic, desperate performance of wealth inside a kingdom where I held absolute, unquestionable sovereignty. I looked at the authentication screen on my phone. The digital prompt requested the master clearance code for the restaurant's entire point-of-sale network. My parents had trained Brittany to believe she was entitled to everything she wanted, regardless of who she stepped on to get it. They had enabled DeAndre's toxic superiority complex because it validated their own shallow obsession with status. Tonight, that entire generational cycle of enabling and emotional abuse was going to hit a brutal, unforgiving brick wall. I tapped my thumb against the biometric scanner. A soft green checkmark illuminated the screen, instantly syncing with Dominic's silver tablet via the internal encrypted network. The master backend of the restaurant's financial software unlocked, exposing the raw data of Table 4. I reached across the table and gently took the tablet from Dominic's hands. The screen displayed the rapidly escalating tab. The Wagyu beef, the white truffle risotto, the imported caviar tower, and the wildly expensive vintage wine. At the very bottom of the screen, listed securely under the guaranteed payment section, was my personal black card. It was the invisible safety net catching their reckless financial freefall. With a slow, deliberate swipe of my index finger, I highlighted the payment data. I pressed the override and delete command. A secondary prompt flashed on the screen in bright red lettering, warning me that removing the card would leave the massive balance completely unsecured and flag the table for mandatory manual payment. I did not hesitate for a single second. I confirmed the deletion. The financial tether snapped. The safety net vanished entirely. Table 4 was now flying completely blind, racking up a catastrophic bill that DeAndre would be forced to face with his own rapidly dwindling resources. I handed the tablet back to Dominic, who accepted it with a crisp, knowing nod. The digital execution was officially complete. "Let them eat," I ordered. Dominic bowed his head in silent acknowledgement and glided out of the owner's suite, moving with the stealth of a phantom. I remained seated in my plush leather chair, swirling the rich Pinot Noir in my glass, as I directed my gaze back through the soundproof glass floor. Down below in the glittering expanse of the main dining room, the performance at Table 4 was escalating into pure, unadulterated theater. Brittany was in her absolute element, intoxicated by the illusion of supreme power. I watched as she aggressively waved her hand in the air, snapping her fingers at a passing busboy who was carrying a tray of delicate crystal flutes. She pointed sharply at her empty bread plate, her face contorted into an ugly, entitled scowl. The young man nodded apologetically and rushed to fulfill her command. She did not offer him a single smile or a basic word of thanks. To my sister, the restaurant staff were simply background props existing entirely to validate her manufactured status. DeAndre was equally insufferable. The sommelier had returned with the spectacular vintage Chateau Margaux, presenting it with the quiet reverence such a historic bottle demanded. DeAndre did not even bother to inspect the label or engage in the customary tasting ritual. He simply waved his hand, dismissing the expert deep knowledge, and demanded the wine be poured immediately to the brim of his glass. He lifted the goblet, swirling the dark liquid vigorously, and laughed loudly enough to draw irritated glances from an adjacent table of actual Wall Street executives. He was entirely oblivious to how foolish he looked. He was a man pretending to be a titan of industry, completely unaware that he was sitting in a kingdom built by the quiet woman he had just banished to the lobby. "Mom, look at this," Leo said, pulling my attention away from the spectacle below. He held up a perfectly golden French fry coated in truffle oil, a massive grin on his face. "This is the best dinner ever. The chef even made me a huge chocolate milkshake." I smiled warmly at my son, reaching across the marble table to wipe a smudge of chocolate from his chin. "I am so glad you like it, sweetheart. You deserve the best birthday dinner in the whole world." Watching Leo happily enjoy his meal in the safety of the private suite reinforced exactly why I was doing this. My son was kind, humble, and deeply appreciative of everything he received. I absolutely refused to let him grow up thinking that DeAndre and Brittany represented what success looked like. I refused to let him believe that power meant treating working-class people like garbage or tearing down your own family members to elevate yourself. Tonight was about breaking that toxic cycle forever. The heavy oak door unlatched, and Dominic stepped back into the suite. His face was a mask of absolute professionalism, but the slight tightening around his eyes told me he had an urgent update. He approached my table, leaning down slightly to speak in a hushed, confidential tone. Madame Dominic began. I just spoke with the head sommelier regarding table 4. The gentleman has escalated his ordering. They have added an imported seafood tower and asked to review the reserve list for a second bottle of wine. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely impressed by their sheer greed. Let them order whatever they want, Dominic. The higher the bill, the harder the fall. Is there an issue with the service? No issue with the service, Madame Dominic replied smoothly. However, the gentleman made a very specific, boastful comment to the sommelier that I felt you needed to hear. When informed that the reserve list features bottles starting at $3,000, the gentleman laughed. He pulled out a heavy metal credit card, tapped it against his water glass, and loudly announced that he would be paying with his corporate card. He claimed he was hosting a highly lucrative client dinner and that his firm was picking up the entire tab. A sudden electric jolt of adrenaline surged straight through my veins. A cold, predatory smile spread across my face as the absolute brilliance of DeAndre's fatal mistake clicked into place. A corporate card. In the American financial sector, corporate expense accounts are monitored with ruthless, unforgiving precision. I knew the exact policies of the mid-tier firm where DeAndre worked as a vice president. They required heavily documented, itemized receipts for every single transaction. Using a company card to fund a lavish multi-thousand-dollar personal dinner with your wife and children was not just a fireable offense, it was textbook corporate embezzlement. It was wire fraud. DeAndre was planning to commit a federal financial crime right in the middle of my dining room. The pieces of the puzzle aligned perfectly in my mind. DeAndre's personal credit cards were completely maxed out. He had likely planned to pay for this extravagant meal, using my card on file, pretending to the waitstaff that he was covering the bill. But now that he was actively trying to impress the room and assert his dominance, he wanted the physical theatricality of throwing down a heavy metal card. He was banking on the fact that he could forge a fake client list on Monday morning and slip the massive expense past his company's accounting department. He was betting his entire career on a lie to save his fragile ego. If DeAndre used a personal credit card, when the bill arrived, the transaction would undoubtedly be declined for insufficient funds. He would face severe embarrassment, maybe call my parents crying for a bailout, and walk away with his ego bruised, but his career intact. But if he actually swiped that corporate card, he would trigger an automatic fraud investigation that would instantly destroy his livelihood. He wanted to play the high-rolling finance king. I was going to give him the rope to hang his entire career. Dominic, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. I need you to listen to me very carefully. When they finish their meal and you present them with the final bill, they are going to panic. DeAndre will try to use his personal cards first to avoid triggering a corporate flag for such a massive amount. I locked eyes with my general manager, making sure he understood the absolute severity of my command. When he hands you his personal credit cards, I do not care if they have a sufficient balance or not. I want you to manually decline every single personal card he offers you. Tell him his bank is blocking the transaction. Block his debit cards. Block Brittany's cards. Block every single personal avenue of escape he tries to use. Dominic's eyes widened slightly, instantly grasping the devastating nature of the trap. You want to corner him, madam? Exactly, I said, leaning back into the shadows of my chair, staring down through the glass floor at the man who had tried to humiliate me. I want him sweating. I want him desperate. I want him entirely out of options in front of the entire restaurant. When the bill comes, decline all his personal cards. Force him to use the corporate one. Dominic nodded with absolute understanding. He turned on his heel and exited the private suite, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the restaurant's ventilation and the soft clinking of my son eating his fries. I leaned forward and rested my forearms on the cool marble table, staring down through the soundproof glass floor. The appetizers had just arrived at table 4. A waiter set down a massive tower of imported caviar, complete with mother-of-pearl spoons and traditional blinis. Brittany immediately whipped out her phone to take a video, adjusting the lighting and making DeAndre pose with a glass of champagne. My phone vibrated violently against the table, shattering the quiet sanctuary of the suite. The caller ID flashed on the screen. It was a joint FaceTime audio call from my parents, Carol and Thomas. They had clearly spent the last 20 minutes listening to Brittany's distorted version of the lobby encounter, and were now calling to deliver my official sentencing. I swiped the green button to accept the call, bringing the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened to the heavy, judgmental silence on the other end of the line. Hannah, my mother, began, her voice dripping with that familiar, syrupy disappointment she reserved specially for me. Where are you right now? Please tell me you took Leo straight home and did not cause any more scenes on the street. We are eating, Mom, I replied, my tone perfectly even and completely devoid of the defensive anger she was undoubtedly expecting. I heard my father sigh loudly in the background. Good, Thomas interjected, his voice stern and commanding, because your behavior tonight was utterly shameful. DeAndre was generous enough to offer you cash to go get something appropriate for your budget, and you threw a tantrum like a spoiled teenager. He is celebrating a massive milestone, Hannah. He needs that table to entertain, and Brittany deserves to be treated to a luxury experience. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the rich flavor while I watched DeAndre loudly snap his fingers at a busboy down below. The sheer disconnect between my parents' delusional worship of this man and his actual behavior was astounding. He hijacked a reservation I made 6 months ago, I stated simply, offering them just enough rope to hang themselves. I wanted to see exactly how far they would go to protect his fragile ego. Oh, stop being so petty, Carol snapped, abandoning her fake sweetness entirely. You could never afford a proper meal at the Obsidian anyway. You know their cancellation policy is strict, so Brittany and DeAndre did you a massive favor by taking the table off your hands so you would not be charged a fee. You should be thanking them instead of acting like a jealous dropout. The phrase hit the air like a physical strike. A jealous dropout. That was their favorite weapon. When I was 20 years old, I took a gap year from my finance degree to care for my newborn son while launching my first consulting business. My parents had labeled me a failure, instantly predicting I would end up destitute and alone. They entirely ignored the fact that I eventually finished my degree online, passed my licensing exams, and built an empire that bought out Michelin star restaurants. In their minds, I was still the disgraced daughter who ruined her life while Brittany was the triumphant queen who married a finance king. You really need to learn from your brother-in-law, my father lectured, his voice echoing through the speaker. DeAndre is a vice president. He understands how the world works. He understands corporate networking and high-level hospitality. He is a true provider for your sister. If you paid attention to how successful people operate instead of wallowing in your own failures, maybe you would not be struggling to afford a basic birthday dinner for your son. I looked down at the dining room. The waiter was bringing out the first course of Wagyu beef tartare. Brittany was laughing, tossing her head back, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband's bank accounts were entirely empty. I knew the truth. I knew DeAndre had begged his own mother for mortgage money just that morning. I knew his credit utilization was redlining. I knew he was sitting at my table eating my food, preparing to commit corporate fraud just to impress the very people who were currently lecturing me on the phone. My parents were giving me a masterclass in psychological manipulation. They were trying to break my spirit, trying to force me to apologize for existing, trying to make me worship a man who was actively destroying his own family's future. For 33 years, this exact tactic had worked. I used to cry. I used to argue. I used to beg them to see my side of the story. I used to twist myself into knots trying to prove my worth to two people who were entirely committed to misunderstanding me. But not tonight. Tonight, their words meant absolutely nothing. Their insults were hollow, pathetic echoes bouncing off the walls of my multi-million-dollar private suite. Hannah, are you even listening to me? My mother demanded, her voice shrill with annoyance at my silence. You owe DeAndre a massive apology. I expect you to call him tomorrow morning and thank him for his generosity tonight. I watched DeAndre lift his crystal glass of $6,000 vintage wine, toasting to his own magnificent delusion. I felt a profound, beautiful sense of absolute power wash over my entire body. I did not need to fight them. I just needed to let gravity do its job. You are absolutely right, Dad. I said, my voice smooth, calm, and terrifyingly agreeable. I really should pay closer attention to how DeAndre operates. There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. They had expected resistance. My sudden compliance threw them completely off balance. Well, my father muttered, clearly taken aback. I am glad you are finally showing some maturity, Hannah. It is about time you recognized your sister's blessings. I smiled, keeping my eyes locked on the table below, as Dominic began to make his way across the dining room floor, holding a polished leather billfold perfectly steady in his right hand. You are right, Dad, I repeated, leaning closer to the soundproof glass. We will see exactly how successful DeAndre is tonight. I tapped the red button on my screen, cutting off the connection, before my father could utter another word of blind praise for the man sitting below me. The sudden silence in the owner's suite was a stark, beautiful contrast to the chaotic delusion of my family. I placed the phone face down on the marble table, breathing in the quiet power of the room. My attention locked onto the glass floor, tracking the precise movements of my staff. The head sommelier, a distinguished gentleman named Francois, was approaching table 4. He carried a silver tray holding 2 crystal Bordeaux glasses and the legendary 1990 Chateau Margaux. Even from my vantage point on the second floor, I could see the pristine condition of the label and the dark, heavy glass of the bottle. In the world of fine dining, presenting a bottle of this caliber is a ritual of absolute respect. Francois moved with the practiced elegance of a man who understood the historical and financial weight of what he was pouring. DeAndre, however, completely lacked the capacity to understand anything beyond his own ego. As Francois presented the bottle, turning the label so DeAndre could inspect the vintage, my brother-in-law waved his hand dismissively. He did not ask to examine the cork. He did not wait for the customary tasting pour to check the integrity of the wine. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, threw his arm over the backrest, and loudly instructed Francois to just fill the glasses. His voice carried across the dining room, cutting through the refined acoustic environment of the restaurant. I watched the faces of the patrons at the adjacent tables. A group of seasoned investment bankers seated to their left exchanged irritated glances. An older couple to their right discreetly shifted their chairs away from the noise. DeAndre was entirely oblivious to their disdain. He believed their stares were born of envy. He was putting on a performance, projecting his voice so everyone in his immediate vicinity would know he was ordering the best of the best. He even turned to his 2 young children, pointing at the bottle and boasting about how their father only drank the finest imports. The kids, completely uninterested in a bottle of fermented grape juice, simply stared blankly at their plates. DeAndre was not talking to them. He was talking to his own deeply rooted insecurities. He needed to hear himself say the words out loud to convince himself that he had finally made it to the top of the social ladder. He was a man actively constructing his own financial coffin, mistaking the sound of hammering nails for applause. Brittany immediately seized the moment for her own digital performance. As Francois carefully poured the dark ruby liquid into the crystal glasses, my sister snatched her phone from the table. She leaned heavily against DeAndre, holding her glass up to catch the soft, ambient lighting of the chandelier above them. She snapped photo after photo, checking her screen, adjusting her posture, and snapping again. She made sure the iconic Chateau Margaux label was perfectly centered in the frame. I could picture the exact caption she was typing into Instagram. She would boast about the vintage. She would tag the restaurant location again. She would likely mention how DeAndre surprised her with a $6,000 bottle just to celebrate a random Tuesday. She was securing her position as the ultimate trophy wife in her social circle, entirely unaware that the trophy was made of cheap plastic and the pedestal was actively crumbling beneath her feet. I looked down at the silver tablet resting on my table. The point of sale feed refreshed with a quiet digital pulse. The line item for the wine appeared at the top of the ledger. $6,000. The sheer visual impact of that number hitting the screen was exhilarating. Below it, the charges for the Wagyu beef, the truffle risotto, the imported mineral water, and the children's extravagant lobster meals stacked up rapidly. DeAndre was ordering side dishes and premium additions with wild abandon. The system automatically calculated the running total, updating in real time as the kitchen logged each new request. $6,800, $7,200. The numbers spun higher and higher, representing a level of reckless consumption that bordered on financial suicide for a man in DeAndre's position. He was relying entirely on the safety net of my detached credit card, leaping into the void with absolute confidence that I would catch him. The audacity required to hijack my reservation, banish my son and me to the street, and then aggressively exploit my financial resources was staggering. But the consequence of that audacity was going to be absolutely legendary. The heavy oak door of the suite opened with a soft click. Dominic stepped inside his polished leather shoes, making no sound against the thick carpeting. He approached my table with a measured, deliberate pace. His posture was perfectly neutral, but his eyes were locked onto the tablet in front of me. As my general manager, Dominic was legally responsible for the financial security of the establishment on his shift. He was accustomed to catering to the whims of the ultra-wealthy, but he also possessed a razor-sharp instinct for detecting when a patron was writing checks their bank account could not possibly cash. Madam, Dominic said, his voice a low, steady murmur. I have been monitoring the progression of Table 4 from the floor station. The pace of their consumption is highly aggressive. I glanced at the tablet. The running total had just ticked over the $7,500 mark. They are attempting to establish dominance through excessive spending, I replied calmly, not taking my eyes off the screen. It is a very common tactic for people who feel entirely out of their depth. Dominic nodded slowly, processing my assessment. The standard protocol for an unsecured table exhibiting this specific pattern of rapid high-value escalation is to discreetly request a pre-authorization of their payment method. He paused, choosing his next words with careful precision. The current tab has reached $7,500. Given that you have removed your personal card from their file, they are currently dining without any verified financial backing. Shall we halt service and request a credit card before they incur any further debt? I looked down through the glass floor. DeAndre was laughing, holding his glass of wine up to the light, completely consumed by his own arrogance. Brittany was busy filtering her latest selfie, entirely disconnected from the reality of her husband's impending ruin. They were having the absolute time of their lives, perfectly comfortable in their cruelty and entitlement. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I looked up at Dominic, a cold, uncompromising smile resting on my lips. Do not halt the service, Dominic, I said softly. We are going to let them reach the absolute pinnacle of their delusion before we pull the floor out from under them. Go back downstairs, approach their table with your finest service menu, offer them the caviar tower. Dominic absorbed the instruction without a single flicker of hesitation. He bowed gracefully and exited the suite to execute the final phase of the financial snare. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, I turned my attention to a sleek, brushed steel control panel embedded directly into the marble table. The owner's suite was not just visually commanding. It was equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance technology designed for ultimate quality control. With a few precise, deliberate taps, I activated the localized audio feed positioned directly above Table 4. The system was originally installed to allow executives to monitor the acoustics and ensure the waitstaff maintained impeccable service standards. Tonight, it served a much more personal, devastating purpose. The muted hum of the dining room instantly vanished, replaced by the crystal-clear audio of my sister's table broadcasting from the discreet speakers hidden in the ceiling of my suite. I could hear the sharp clinking of heavy silver cutlery scraping against fine bone china. I could hear the aggressive wet sound of DeAndre chewing his excessively expensive meal. And I could hear the exact moment he decided his current audience was simply not large enough to satisfy his monumental, fragile ego. DeAndre pulled his phone from his tailored suit jacket and tapped the brightly illuminated screen. A moment later, the distinct resonant ringing of an outgoing call echoed through my overhead speakers. He placed the phone flat on the crisp white tablecloth and hit the speaker button, forcing everyone in his immediate vicinity to become a captive audience to his vanity. My father answered on the second ring. His voice came booming through the restaurant's sophisticated microphones, loud and unapologetic. DeAndre, my boy Thomas, shouted, the sheer enthusiasm in his tone cutting through the ambient noise of the dining room. Carol, get over here quickly. It is DeAndre calling. Thomas, I had to call you directly from the trenches. DeAndre laughed loudly, leaning far back in his chair and swirling the remaining drops of the $6,000 vintage wine in his crystal glass. Brittany and I are sitting at the Obsidian right now. You know, the exclusive place Hannah was trying to take us before we realized she was entirely out of her depth. We decided to take over the reservation and upgrade the evening. The chef is practically performing miracles for us down here. I heard my mother's voice chime in from the background, practically breathless with fawning adoration. Oh, that sounds absolutely magnificent, DeAndre. We knew you would take charge of the situation. It is so embarrassing when Hannah tries to play pretend. We told her to stop being petty and just appreciate that you stepped up to provide a proper experience for your sister. DeAndre chuckled, a deep, grating sound of pure, unadulterated condescension. I tried to slip her a 50 so she could take the kid to get some fast food. You cannot bring a child into an environment like this and expect them to know how to behave. But you know Hannah, always acting like she is the absolute victim when someone tries to show her a little reality. I sat perfectly still in the owner's suite, my hands resting lightly on my lap. I watched my son Leo quietly drawing on a piece of paper the chef had thoughtfully brought him. His sweet innocence was a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the venom being casually spat through the audio feed. My father's voice dropped into a register of profound, sickening sincerity. I apologize for her behavior, DeAndre. Your mother and I really do. We spent decades trying to teach her how to navigate the real world, but she just lacks the drive. She completely lacks the vision. You, on the other hand, you understand exactly what it takes to build an empire. You understand the importance of legacy. I look at how you provide for Brittany and the kids, how you navigate these high-stakes environments with such effortless ease, and it makes me incredibly proud. To be entirely honest with you, DeAndre, you are the son I always wanted. The words hung heavily in the air, echoing through the hidden speakers of the private suite. You are the son I always wanted. For 33 years, I had chased the elusive phantom of my parents' approval. I had relentlessly pursued academic excellence, pushing myself to the brink of exhaustion to secure top-tier grades. I had built a multi-million-dollar private equity portfolio, from the ground up navigating the most ruthless, cutthroat financial markets in the world. I had endured their snide remarks, their blatant favoritism, and their constant financial exploitation, all while holding out a tiny, fragile sliver of hope that one day they would finally see my worth. I wanted them to look at me with the exact same reverence they currently reserved for a man who was actively drowning in debt and swindling his own company. Hearing my father deliver that ultimate validation to DeAndre was the final definitive blow. But it did not shatter me. Instead, it set me completely free. The invisible, suffocating chains of childhood expectations snapped and fell away. The desperate, aching girl who just wanted her parents to be proud of her completely vanished. She was replaced entirely by the cold, calculating executive sitting at the absolute top of the food chain. I realized with absolute clarity that their approval was a worthless currency. It held zero value in the real world. They were superficial, hollow people, worshipping a superficial, hollow man. I did not want their love anymore. I wanted their total, crushing realization of what they had thrown away. Down on the dining floor, the phone call concluded with a chorus of mutual praise and a firm promise to meet for brunch the following day. DeAndre disconnected the call, looking incredibly satisfied with himself. He turned his attention back to the dining room just as Dominic approached table 4. My general manager moved with lethal, quiet elegance. He carried a silver tray lined with black velvet, presenting a leather-bound reserve menu specifically curated for the most elite patrons. Sir Dominic said, his smooth voice carrying perfectly through the audio feed. The executive chef has noted your exceptional taste this evening. He wishes to offer you an exclusive off-menu presentation. The Imperial Beluga Caviar Tower. It is sourced directly from the Caspian Sea and accompanied by vintage champagne-infused blinis. It is an extraordinary experience we reserve only for our most distinguished guests. DeAndre's eyes widened greedily. He did not ask for the price. He did not hesitate or consult his wife. He simply waved his hand in a grand sweeping gesture of supreme arrogance. "Bring it out immediately," DeAndre ordered loudly. "We only do the best here." "Very good, sir," Dominic replied smoothly. He tapped the silver tablet in his hand. The item locked firmly into the point-of-sale system. Up in the owner's suite, I watched the digital ledger update in real time on the glass screen. $1,500 was instantly added to the massive running total. The tab was now cresting dangerously toward the $10,000 mark, entirely unmoored from any financial safety net. The trap was finally and fully loaded. I sat back in my leather chair, letting the quiet reality of the moment wash over me. Through the soundproof glass floor, I watched the grand arrival of the Imperial Beluga Caviar Tower. It was a masterpiece of culinary architecture shimmering under the ambient light of the restaurant. Brittany clapped her hands together in sheer delight, pulling DeAndre into another aggressively staged selfie. They looked like the ultimate power couple, radiating wealth and untouchable success. My phone, which had been silent since I hung up on my father, suddenly vibrated against the marble table. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from a number I had saved but rarely interacted with. It was Simone, DeAndre's older sister. Unlike DeAndre, Simone was a fiercely practical, hardworking woman who managed a public school district in Chicago. She saw right through her brother's flashy exterior and had always treated me with quiet, unspoken solidarity at family events. We were the two women standing on the periphery, watching the golden children perform. I swiped open the message, expecting a generic holiday check-in or a question about my parents. What I read instead completely solidified the absolute destruction heading toward table 4. Hannah Simone wrote, her digital words carrying a heavy, frantic energy. "I know you are in New York and I hate to drag you into this, but I need you to be careful around DeAndre and your sister tonight. He called our mother at 6 o'clock this morning. He was crying, Hannah. He begged her to empty her emergency savings account and wire him $5,000 immediately. He said the bank is initiating foreclosure proceedings on their house next week if he does not cover the mortgage arrears. He has drained everything. He has absolutely zero liquidity. Mom is devastated and terrified for her grandchildren. Please tell me you are not letting him use your credit cards for anything. He is completely bankrupt." I read the message twice, my eyes tracing the stark, undeniable truth laid out in sharp black text. I looked up from the screen and stared down at the dining room. DeAndre was currently dipping a mother-of-pearl spoon into a mound of imported caviar, feeding a perfectly portioned bite to his grinning wife. The profound, sickening cognitive dissonance of the scene was almost too much to process. Less than 14 hours ago, this man had been sobbing on the phone, begging his hardworking mother to surrender her modest emergency savings just to keep a roof over his children's heads. He had stripped his own mother of her financial security to hide his massive failures. And now, armed with a fresh infusion of desperately borrowed cash, he was sitting in a Michelin star restaurant, aggressively flaunting wealth he did not possess. He had handed me a crumpled $50 bill, with a sneer, acting like a benevolent billionaire dispensing charity to a peasant. That $50 bill was likely part of the very money he had just drained from his mother's retirement fund. The level of sociopathic detachment required to pull off a stunt like this was staggering. He was eating away his children's housing security, one bite of caviar at a time. I looked at Brittany. She was tossing her perfectly styled hair, laughing at a joke the waiter made, radiating the blissful, arrogant ignorance of a woman who believed she had won the lottery of life. She was utterly oblivious to the reality that her entire existence was a hollow, fragile house of cards. She thought she was married to a financial titan who could casually command the best tables in New York City. She had absolutely no idea she was legally tied to a desperate, sinking fraud who was stealing from his own family to fund her social media aesthetic. My parents had raised her to value the appearance of wealth above all else, and she had married a man who weaponized that exact flaw. The rage I had felt earlier completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, clinical fascination. You cannot be angry at a ghost. And professionally speaking, DeAndre was a dead man walking. He had built a meticulously crafted illusion of superiority, and he was currently spending his very last stolen pennies to reinforce it in front of a dining room full of strangers who did not care if he lived or died. I quickly typed a reply to Simone. Do not worry about me, Simone. My assets are completely locked down. Please tell your mother to freeze her bank accounts immediately, call her bank's fraud department, and refuse any further transfers. DeAndre's financial illusions are coming to a very abrupt public end tonight. You need to protect yourselves before the fallout hits. I hit send, setting the phone down on the marble surface. I returned my undivided attention to the glass floor. The pacing of the lavish meal was finally reaching its inevitable disastrous conclusion. The caviar tower had been decimated, reduced to empty shells and stained ice. The $6,000 bottle of vintage Chateau Margaux had been drained to the absolute last drop, the heavy glass bottle sitting empty like a monument to financial ruin. The servers moved in with their signature quiet efficiency, gracefully clearing the heavy porcelain plates and sweeping away the breadcrumbs with tiny silver brushes. DeAndre leaned back heavily in his chair, rubbing his stomach with a satisfied, arrogant groan. He snapped his fingers one last time, signaling the waitstaff for a round of double espressos and imported after-dinner chocolates to close out the extravagant feast. He looked around the pristine dining room, his chest puffed out, drinking in the atmosphere of the elite establishment. He truly believed he had conquered the room. He believed he had successfully pushed me out of his kingdom and proven his undisputed dominance to my parents, to his wife, and to himself. The delicate espresso cups were placed gently on the white tablecloth. DeAndre took a slow theatrical sip, nodding his firm approval to Brittany, who was already busy applying a digital filter to her final batch of photos for her Instagram feed. The illusion was complete. The performance was over. The heavy velvet curtain was finally ready to drop. From the shadows near the kitchen entrance, Dominic materialized. He carried a sleek, heavy black leather billfold containing the final reckoning. He did not rush. He walked with the slow, measured executioner's pace that we had quietly agreed upon in the suite above. He navigated through the maze of occupied tables, his expression a mask of absolute, unyielding professional neutrality. He possessed the terrifying calm of a man who knew he was carrying a ticking financial bomb. Every single step he took brought the crushing, undeniable weight of reality closer to the fragile fantasy world DeAndre had constructed. I leaned forward in the owner's suite, resting my chin on my intertwined hands, my eyes tracking Dominic's relentless, inevitable approach. The digital ledger on my silver tablet glowed with the final catastrophic calculation. Dominic arrived at table 4. He bowed his head slightly, presenting a perfect, flawless portrait of high-end hospitality, and placed the black leather billfold gently onto the crisp white tablecloth right next to DeAndre's espresso cup. The final tab was exactly $10,250. DeAndre barely registered the heavy black leather billfold as Dominic placed it seamlessly onto the pristine white tablecloth. For a man who had built his entire personality around projecting immense wealth, DeAndre treated the arrival of the check with practiced theatrical indifference. He leaned back heavily against his chair, interlacing his fingers behind his head and stretching the fabric of his custom-tailored suit jacket. He flashed a brilliant, gleaming smile at Brittany, completely ignoring the general manager standing at attention beside their table. In the rarefied air of high society, dining acknowledging the physical bill is considered gauche. Truly wealthy people do not sweat over the final number. They simply wave a hand and let their limitless accounts absorb the damage. DeAndre was actively cosplaying this exact level of nonchalance. Downstairs, Brittany mirrored his arrogant detachment perfectly. She did not even glance at the leather folder containing the financial reckoning of their extravagant feast. Instead, she picked up her smartphone, checking the engagement metrics on her recently uploaded caviar selfie. She was busy basking in the digital validation of her fabricated lifestyle, entirely oblivious to the very real, very physical threat resting just inches from her elbow. Up in the owner suite, I leaned closer to the observation glass, my eyes tracking every micro expression on DeAndre's face. I watched him inhale deeply, his chest expanding with the false confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully stolen a $10,000 meal from the woman he relentlessly degraded. DeAndre finally turned his attention to Dominic. He did not open the leather folder. He did not ask to review the itemized charges. He simply reached out with one manicured finger and casually pushed the billfold back toward the edge of the table. He offered Dominic a dismissive, patronizing smile, the kind of expression a king gives a peasant who has just delivered a satisfactory tribute. "Just put it on the card on file," DeAndre commanded, his deep voice, carrying a tone of absolute, unquestionable authority. "And go ahead and add a 20% gratuity for the service. You all did an adequate job tonight. Tell the chef the Wagyu was acceptable." DeAndre laced his hands over his stomach, turning back to Brittany to discuss which elite cocktail lounge they should grace with their presence next. He had executed his move perfectly. He had demonstrated his magnanimous nature by tipping generously with my money, cementing his status as a high-rolling finance executive in front of his wife and the surrounding tables. He fully expected Dominic to offer a gracious bow, retrieve the leather folder, and disappear into the shadows to process the astronomical transaction on my personal platinum card. But Dominic did not move. He did not offer a gracious bow. He did not reach for the black leather folder. He simply stood there, his posture impeccably straight, his hands clasped respectfully behind his back. The absolute stillness of my general manager created an immediate suffocating vacuum of tension at the table. In the ultra-refined world of Michelin star hospitality, a lingering manager is the ultimate red flag. It is a silent alarm indicating a severe, unbridgeable, catastrophic error in the natural order of service. DeAndre noticed the hesitation. His arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked up at Dominic, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. The surrounding tables, sensing the subtle disruption in the atmosphere, began to cast discreet, curious glances toward table 4. "I am sorry, sir," Dominic said. His voice was incredibly smooth, perfectly polite, yet it possessed a sharp, cutting clarity that ensured every single syllable reached DeAndre's ears with devastating precision. "I am afraid I cannot accommodate that request. The card holder for this reservation has explicitly revoked all authorization for your party." DeAndre froze. The ambient noise of the bustling dining room seemed to instantly evaporate, replaced by a deafening, terrifying silence. Up in the glass suite, I watched the exact moment his brain attempted to process the catastrophic meaning behind Dominic's impeccably delivered sentence. Revoked authorization. The words struck him with the physical force of a speeding freight train. Down below, Brittany slowly lowered her smartphone. Her perfectly contoured face went entirely slack as the reality of the situation breached the impenetrable walls of her delusion. She looked at the black leather billfold, then at Dominic, and finally at her husband. Her eyes widened with a sudden gripping terror. She knew DeAndre's financial reality better than she let on to the rest of the world, and she knew exactly what being left to cover a luxury dinner meant for their fragile bank accounts. "Wait, what do you mean she revoked it?" Brittany demanded, her voice cracking with high-pitched panic. "My sister booked this table. Her card is supposed to cover the entire evening. We are family. She would never cancel the payment." Dominic maintained his absolute terrifying professionalism. He did not break eye contact with DeAndre, completely ignoring Brittany's hysterical outburst. "The primary account has been entirely detached from this ledger by the cardholder," Sir Dominic clarified, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or misunderstanding. "The balance for this evening's service is completely unsecured." He took a deliberate, measured step closer to the table, ensuring DeAndre felt the full crushing weight of the establishment bearing down on his shoulders. Dominic's gaze was unrelenting, piercing straight through the cheap facade of the supposedly wealthy executive. "How would you like to pay?" The color drained from DeAndre's face, leaving an ashen, grayish pallor behind. The facade of the powerful, untouchable finance executive shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. His breathing grew shallow and erratic. I could see the cold sweat instantly forming along his hairline, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers above. He was a man who had proudly leaped off a financial cliff, entirely confident that my money would catch him, only to look down and see solid, unforgiving concrete rapidly approaching. He stared at the black leather billfold like it was a live explosive device. The $10,250 balance was no longer a theoretical number on my tab. It was a massive immediate debt tied directly to his name. His fake arrogant smile was permanently frozen on his face, morphing into a grotesque mask of sheer unadulterated panic. His eyes darted wildly around the dining room, realizing that the very people he had been loudly trying to impress were now watching his humiliating downfall. Slowly, agonizingly, DeAndre reached a trembling hand inside his tailored suit jacket. He fumbled for his designer wallet, his fingers visibly shaking as he prepared to face the $10,000 reality he had just created. DeAndre withdrew a sleek silver American Express card from the leather folds of his wallet. He pushed it across the white tablecloth toward Dominic with a forced, breathless chuckle. He was desperately trying to project the image of a man merely inconvenienced by a minor administrative error. "It is probably just a security flag," DeAndre muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his upper lip. "I travel frequently for business, so my bank tends to be overly cautious with large, unexpected dining charges. Just push it through." Dominic did not offer a comforting smile. He simply produced a handheld point-of-sale terminal from the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. The Obsidian transactions were processed directly at the table to ensure the utmost security for our elite clientele. Tonight, that luxurious convenience was serving as a public execution block. Dominic inserted the silver card into the terminal. He tapped the screen to initiate the staggering $10,250 charge. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a sharp, piercing electronic beep shattered the tense silence surrounding Table 4. The screen flashed a harsh, unforgiving red light. "Declined," Dominic stated, his voice carrying effortlessly across the quiet dining room. "The card issuer has refused the transaction for insufficient funds. Would you care to try another method of payment?" DeAndre's jaw dropped. The remaining color drained completely from his face. He snatched the American Express back as if it had physically burned him. "It is a bank glitch," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch and volume as panic completely overtook his carefully constructed finance bro persona. "I have excellent credit. Run this one instead." He frantically dug back into his wallet and produced a standard blue Visa card. His hands were trembling so violently that he nearly dropped it on the floor. Dominic accepted the second card with unwavering professional grace. He inserted it into the terminal. The machine whirred for another 2 seconds before issuing the exact same sharp, humiliating beep. The screen flashed red once again. "Declined." Dominic repeated, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "Insufficient funds." The absolute humiliation was palpable. At the adjacent tables, the quiet hum of wealthy patrons actively stopped. The group of Wall Street executives who had been irritated by DeAndre's loud boasting earlier were now openly staring, exchanging amused, knowing smirks. The older couple to their right leaned in to whisper to each other, their eyes locked on the unfolding disaster. DeAndre was shrinking under the crushing weight of their collective judgment. He was exposed as an absolute fraud in front of the very people he had spent the entire evening trying to impress. Brittany let out a high-pitched gasp of terror. She grabbed her smartphone from the table with trembling hands. "This is just a stupid system glitch," she hissed at her husband, her eyes wide with sheer panic. "I am calling Hannah right now. She needs to fix this immediately. She must have messed up the reservation portal when she left." Up in the owner's suite, I sat perfectly still. My phone illuminated the dark marble table, vibrating aggressively as Brittany's incoming call lit up the screen. I looked down through the soundproof glass floor, watching my sister hold her phone to her ear in absolute desperation. I picked up my phone, looked at her panicked face, and pressed the red decline button. Downstairs, Brittany stared at her phone screen in sheer disbelief as the call disconnected. The reality of my explicit rejection struck her like a physical blow. She tapped her screen frantically, her perfectly manicured fingers shaking as she bypassed my number and immediately dialed our parents. Through the soundproof glass floor, I watched her press the phone to her ear, her face contorting into a mask of pure, desperate hysteria. She was pacing slightly, waving her free hand toward DeAndre, who sat frozen in his chair like a man awaiting a firing squad. Less than 30 seconds later, my phone vibrated violently against the marble table. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name. They were moving exactly as predictably as I had anticipated, treating me as an emergency ATM the second their golden child faced a minor inconvenience. I picked up the phone and accepted the call, holding it to my ear without saying a word. "Hannah, what on earth is wrong with you?" my mother shrieked. Her voice was entirely devoid of the syrupy manipulation she had used earlier, replaced by raw, unhinged panic. "Brittany is practically hyperventilating. She said the restaurant is declining DeAndre's cards and you canceled the reservation payment. Stop being petty right this instant. Call that manager, fix this glitch, and pay for your sister's dinner before they are completely humiliated." I kept my eyes locked on the dining room below, watching DeAndre desperately search his wallet for a miracle that did not exist. "There is no glitch, Mom," I replied, my voice carrying the absolute chilling calm of a woman who held all the cards. "I simply removed my financial information from a table I was kicked out of. I am not paying for a meal I was not allowed to eat." "You are acting like a spiteful child," she screamed, the desperation in her voice echoing loudly through the speaker. "DeAndre is family. You cannot just leave them stranded with a massive bill. It is $10,000, Hannah. They do not have that kind of liquid cash available tonight. You need to be the bigger person and cover this." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool marble. "Why would I need to do that?" I asked smoothly. "DeAndre is a vice president, right? He is a true provider who understands how the world works. He just closed a massive deal. A $10,000 dinner should not be an issue for a finance king. Tell him to use that elite corporate networking he is so famous for." "Hannah, do not you dare do this to your sister!" My mother gasped, completely abandoning her defense of DeAndre's wealth. "If they cannot pay, the restaurant will call the police. You are going to ruin their lives over a petty grudge." "I did not ruin anything," I stated firmly. DeAndre ordered the caviar. DeAndre ordered the vintage wine. DeAndre demanded to be treated like royalty. Now he gets to pay the royal tax. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button, cutting off her frantic screaming instantly. I set the device face down on the table, silencing the endless toxic demands of my family for good. Down in the main dining room, the atmosphere was shifting from uncomfortable to highly severe. Dominic stood patiently at table 4, offering absolutely no avenues of escape. With a subtle, barely perceptible nod of his head, he issued a silent command to the floor staff. From the shadows of the elegant lobby, 2 broad-shouldered security guards in dark suits stepped forward. They moved with quiet, terrifying precision, slowly positioning themselves directly in front of the heavy glass exit doors. The perimeter was officially secured. DeAndre and Brittany were completely trapped. DeAndre saw the security guards shift into position by the doors. The realization hit him with the physical force of a sledgehammer. There was no dining and dashing at the Obsidian. There was no calling a friend for a quick favor, and there was certainly no charming his way out of a $10,000 theft of services. He was entirely, undeniably cornered. Heavy beads of sweat rolled down the sides of his face, soaking into the stiff, expensive collar of his custom dress shirt. His breathing became ragged and shallow. Brittany sat completely paralyzed across from him, her phone clutched in her lap, utterly useless. The facade of the untouchable finance king had melted away, revealing a terrified, desperate man staring down the barrel of immediate public arrest. His hands shook violently as he reached back into his designer wallet. He pushed past the empty debit cards and the maxed-out personal credit lines. His fingers hesitated over a thick, brushed metal card tucked securely in the very back slot. It was his firm's elite corporate expense card. In the corporate financial sector, using that specific piece of metal for a personal extravagant dinner was the absolute ultimate taboo. It was a direct violation of federal compliance laws. Swiping that card meant risking immediate termination, blacklisting from the industry, and severe criminal charges. But DeAndre was a man trapped in the blinding panic of the present moment. He weighed the abstract future threat of a corporate audit against the immediate humiliating reality of being hauled out of a Michelin star restaurant in handcuffs in front of his wife and peers. His ego made the choice for him. He pulled the heavy metal card from his wallet. He did not slam it down on the table with his usual theatrical arrogance. Instead, he slid it across the crisp white linen, sliding it directly under the black leather billfold. He leaned forward, looking up at Dominic with wide, desperate eyes. "Run it quietly," DeAndre whispered, his voice cracking under the crushing pressure of his own fraud. "Just process it and let us leave." Dominic accepted the corporate card with the same emotionless, terrifying grace he had displayed all evening. He smoothly inserted the heavy metal into the handheld point-of-sale terminal. Up in the owner's suite, I leaned entirely over the edge of the marble table, my eyes locked onto the live digital feed on my silver tablet. I watched the system recognize the payment method. The screen displayed the corporate issuer name. I held my breath. I knew exactly what was about to happen. DeAndre had drained his personal accounts to the point of foreclosure, and a man that desperate had undoubtedly already triggered internal red flags at his firm. He was attempting to steal $10,000 from a company that was already watching him. Dominic stood perfectly still as the terminal processed the transaction. The machine whirred for 3 excruciating seconds. Suddenly, the terminal emitted a sharp, loud, continuous alarm tone that sliced through the quiet dining room. The screen on my tablet flashed a brilliant, blinding red. "Account frozen, suspected fraud." The harsh, continuous alarm tone from the handheld terminal was designed specifically to catch attention. It was not a subtle, quiet alert. It was an aggressive, blaring siren that cut through the refined acoustic atmosphere of the main dining room like a warning bell in a cathedral. Every single conversation within a 50-foot radius instantly died. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Wine glasses were lowered to the crisp white tablecloths. In the ultra-wealthy ecosystem of the Obsidian, a declined card was an unfortunate embarrassment. A triggered fraud alert was a sheer, undeniable spectacle. Dominic did not flinch, nor did he attempt to muffle the sound of the blaring terminal. He held the machine perfectly still, allowing the glaring red light of the screen to reflect directly onto DeAndre's sweating face. Downstairs, the blood completely drained from my brother-in-law's cheeks. He reached across the table, his fingers frantically clawing at the air, desperately trying to snatch the terminal back before his professional ruin became entirely public. "Give that back to me," DeAndre hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of suppressed rage and profound, paralyzing panic. "There is a mistake. There is a massive mistake. Give me the card." Dominic smoothly pulled the terminal just out of DeAndre's desperate reach. He stood impeccably tall, squaring his shoulders as he looked down at the crumbling executive. When Dominic spoke, he did not use the hushed, discreet whisper customary for handling financial discrepancies in luxury establishments. He used his full, resonant voice, ensuring that his words carried effortlessly to the adjacent tables. "I am afraid I cannot return this card to you, sir." Dominic announced, his tone exceptionally polite, but infused with absolute lethal clarity. "The transaction has not merely been declined. The authorization network has issued a critical seizure mandate. Your employer's internal fraud department has frozen this corporate account, citing suspected embezzlement and unauthorized asset diversion. We are legally required to retain the physical card and surrender it directly to the authorities upon their arrival." The words hung suspended in the dining room air, heavy and inescapable. Embezzlement, unauthorized asset diversion, authorities. Up in the private suite, I watched the absolute destruction of my abuser unfold in glorious high definition. At the neighboring table, the group of seasoned investment bankers openly scoffed. One of them actually leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, wearing an expression of pure, unadulterated amusement as he watched a fellow finance professional crash and burn in spectacular fashion. DeAndre was effectively outed as a corporate thief right in the middle of a Michelin star restaurant. His entire carefully constructed persona as an elite high-rolling titan of industry evaporated in a single devastating sentence. He was left entirely exposed as a desperate bankrupt fraud attempting to steal $10,000 to feed his own vanity. Brittany sat frozen for 3 agonizing seconds, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the dining table so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. Her brain was violently attempting to reconcile the harsh, undeniable truth echoing through the room with the flawless social media narrative she had spent years carefully building. The collision of those two realities produced a volatile, hysterical explosion. She sprang up from her chair, the heavy wood scraping aggressively against the imported marble floor. "You used a company card!" Brittany shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, piercing register that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "Are you completely out of your mind, DeAndre? You told me you got a massive bonus. You told me we had unlimited funds for this dinner. You are stealing from your firm." "Keep your voice down, Brittany," DeAndre pleaded, his hands raised defensively as he practically cowered in his seat. He looked around wildly at the staring patrons, his breathing shallow and rapid. "It is a misunderstanding. I just need to call accounting on Monday morning. I can fix this." "There is no Monday," Brittany screamed, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of high society elegance. The perfect marriage facade shattered, instantly fracturing into ugly, jagged pieces right in front of their terrified children and the shocked high society diners. Her meticulously curated image as the triumphant, pampered queen was actively burning to the ground, and she was desperately trying to distance herself from the blazing inferno. "You lied to me. You dragged us to the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan while completely broke. We are going to be arrested. My friends are sitting 3 tables away, you absolute loser." Her rage was entirely self-centered. She did not care about the legal trouble DeAndre was facing, nor did she express a single ounce of concern for the trauma this violent public meltdown was inflicting on their 2 young kids. Her only concern was her own shattered ego. She had spent the entire evening looking down her nose at the waitstaff and mocking me for wearing plain clothes. Now she was the ultimate punchline. She was the delusional wife of a corporate thief stranded with a $10,000 bill she had absolutely no way of paying. The 2 security guards stationed by the front doors took a synchronized step forward, closing the perimeter even tighter. The trap was sealed. DeAndre buried his face in his hands, completely defeated, a broken shell of the arrogant man who had tried to hand me $50 just 2 hours ago. Brittany, realizing that her husband was entirely useless in salvaging the catastrophic situation, spun around. She redirected her hysterical fury directly at the man standing stoically beside their table. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger straight at Dominic's chest. "This is a targeted setup!" Brittany shrieked, her chest heaving as she desperately searched for a scapegoat to blame for her own massive humiliation. "You intentionally let us order all this food knowing there was an issue with the reservation. You humiliated my family on purpose to extort us. I am not dealing with a jumped-up waiter. I want to speak to the owner of this restaurant right this second. Bring them out here now." Up in the private suite, I stood up from my leather chair. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, adjusting my cuffs with deliberate, calm precision. I picked up my solid black metal owner's card from the marble table. The moment of absolute reckoning had finally arrived. Down on the dining floor, Dominic did not flinch at her aggressive demand. He simply offered Brittany a perfectly measured, incredibly polite smile. "Certainly, Madame," Dominic replied, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying obedience. "She is coming down right now." The heavy oak door of the owner's suite unlatched with a definitive, solid click. I stepped out onto the landing of the grand glass staircase. The crimson velvet rope that had barred me from this exact spot just hours ago now remained unhooked at the bottom, guarded closely by my own staff. I descended the stairs slowly, deliberately. Each step I took on the floating glass treads felt like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. Decades of being told I was unworthy, of being shoved into corners, of being forced to swallow my pride for the sake of family peace, simply vanished into the pristine air of my restaurant. The dining room below was still trapped in the suffocating silence of DeAndre's spectacular public humiliation. Diners were craning their necks, waiting eagerly for the mysterious owner to emerge from the shadows and cast judgment upon the screaming woman and the sweating fraud. Brittany stood rigidly by table 4, her chest heaving, her eyes darting fiercely toward the kitchen doors. She was fully expecting a gray-haired man in an expensive suit to march out and apologize to her for the inconvenience. DeAndre sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly at his confiscated corporate card as if it were a venomous snake. I reached the bottom of the staircase. My heels clicked sharply against the imported marble floor. The sharp sound drew Brittany's gaze. Her furious expression faltered instantly. Confusion washed over her perfectly contoured face as she watched her younger sister, the supposed struggling dropout, walking freely through the highly restricted VIP section. Her confusion instantly morphed into aggressive, blinding annoyance. She honestly thought I had snuck downstairs to witness her public embarrassment and gloat. "What are you doing down here?" Brittany hissed, her voice a venomous, panicked whisper aimed entirely at me. "I told you to take your kid and leave. Get out before the owner gets here and has you arrested for trespassing too." I did not break my stride. I did not flinch. I walked directly past the gaping faces of the Wall Street executives at the adjacent table. I stepped squarely into the center of the disaster zone at table 4. Dominic immediately turned toward me. He did not say a single word to correct my sister. Instead, he executed a perfect, deep, respectful bow. "I await your instructions, Madam," Dominic said clearly. His voice carried the absolute, unwavering loyalty of a general addressing his supreme commander. The collective gasp from the surrounding tables was distinct and highly audible. Brittany physically recoiled, stumbling backward until her designer heels hit the heavy wooden base of a dining chair. Her mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. DeAndre finally looked up from his frozen corporate card. His bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. The total absence of comprehension in his gaze was beautiful to witness. He looked at Dominic, then back at me, his brain completely short-circuiting as the impossible reality crashed down upon his fabricated world. "You?" Brittany choked out her vocal cords, struggling to process the monumental shock. "You cannot be the owner. You are broke. You write code in a tiny apartment. This is a joke." She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at Dominic, her denial desperate and pathetic. "You hired your sister's friend to play a prank on us. This is a setup." She spun around, her voice escalating back into a hysterical shriek that echoed violently off the crystal chandeliers overhead. "She is trying to frame us." Hannah hacked the billing system. "She is trying to destroy DeAndre's career out of pure jealousy because she could never land a real man." I let her scream. I let her flail in the terrifying realization that her entire hierarchy of worth was a complete, devastating illusion. I watched her desperately cling to the false narrative our parents had spoon-fed her since childhood. When she finally paused to draw a ragged, panicked breath, I reached into the pocket of my dress. I pulled out my solid, black, laser-engraved metal owner's card. I tossed it effortlessly onto the crisp white linen. The heavy metal slid across the table, coming to a dead stop right next to DeAndre's confiscated corporate card. The gold insignia of Apex Hospitality caught the ambient light, gleaming with undeniable absolute authority. "I do not know this manager personally, Brittany," I stated, my voice ringing with icy, unyielding calm. "I pay his salary. I own the investment firm that bought this entire restaurant group 3 weeks ago. I own the chair you are gripping. I own the table you just piled $10,000 of unpaid food onto. And I own the absolute right to have you both thrown into the street for criminal theft." DeAndre let out a pathetic, strangled sound. He reached for the black card, his trembling fingers tracing the raised lettering of my title. Managing Partner. The remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray. He finally understood that the woman he had tried to bribe with a crumpled $50 bill was the apex predator of his financial food chain. He had walked willingly into the jaws of a beast he assumed was a mouse. Hannah, please. DeAndre begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whimper. You have to tell them to release my corporate card. You know I am good for the money. Just process it through my company. I will handle the accounting on Monday. Please, you have to let this go through or I will lose everything. I looked down at the terrified, broken man sitting in front of me. I looked at the frozen corporate card sitting on the table representing the absolute pinnacle of his greed, his arrogance, and his deception. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I don't need to frame you, DeAndre, Hannah says, looking at his frozen corporate card. Your compliance department called me yesterday to verify if you were hosting a sanctioned corporate event here. I told them the truth, you weren't. DeAndre stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. The realization that I had orchestrated his corporate execution 24 hours in advance completely paralyzed him. He had walked into my restaurant thinking he was pulling a fast one on a naive sister-in-law. Instead, he had walked into a meticulously designed financial guillotine. His jaw opened, but the arrogant excuses he usually relied on had completely evaporated. He was a dead man professionally and financially. Before Brittany could formulate another hysterical screech to defend her crumbling empire, a loud commotion erupted near the front entrance of the dining room. The heavy glass doors swung open violently. My mother and father, Carol and Thomas, burst into the elegant lobby, completely disregarding the refined atmosphere of the restaurant. They marched past the panicked hosts, their faces red with self-righteous fury. They had clearly received Brittany's desperate phone calls and had rushed over from their hotel to rescue their precious golden child from my supposed tyranny. They spotted the security guards boxing in table 4. My mother pushed past a waiter carrying a tray of champagne, not even offering an apology as the glasses rattled dangerously. My father marched right behind her, his chest puffed out, radiating that familiar, overbearing authority he always used to intimidate me into submission. They stormed into the center of the standoff, completely ignoring Dominic and the security team. Their eyes locked onto me, blazing with absolute contempt. Hannah, what is the exact meaning of this? My father bellowed. His voice disrupted the remaining quiet of the dining room, causing the Wall Street executives at the next table to openly cringe at the display. Tell your little friend here to release DeAndre's card immediately. You have taken this petty jealousy way too far. My mother rushed to Brittany's side, wrapping a protective arm around her perfectly contoured, now tear-streaked face. You are an absolute monster, Hannah, my mother hissed at me, her eyes flashing with pure venom. How dare you hack into their billing system and try to frame your brother-in-law for fraud? DeAndre is a vice president. He is a respected provider. You are going to call whoever you need to call, fix this technical glitch, and pay this bill right now before I have you arrested for harassment. I stood my ground, my hands resting calmly at my sides. They were so deeply entrenched in their manufactured reality that they could not even register the solid black owner's card resting on the table, or the fact that the general manager was deferring entirely to my commands. They just wanted to scream me back into the small, compliant box they had built for me. They wanted me to bow my head and absorb their abuse, just like I had done for 33 years. I am not hacking anything, Mom, I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear across the table. I own this restaurant. I own the private equity firm that bought this restaurant. And your highly respected provider of a son-in-law just tried to commit federal wire fraud in my dining room because he is entirely bankrupt. My father let out a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter. Bankrupt. DeAndre makes more in a single month than you do in an entire year. Stop spinning these pathetic lies to cover up your severe jealousy. You are making a fool of yourself. I turned my gaze directly to my father, stripping away every ounce of daughterly deference I had ever shown him. He does not make anything, Dad. He is drowning. I looked directly at my mother, locking onto her furious eyes. He called you at 6 o'clock this morning, crying, begging for a $5,000 loan from your emergency savings to cover his mortgage. Did he tell you why the bank is threatening foreclosure next week? Did he tell you where his massive executive salary actually went? My mother's face dropped instantly. The protective arm she had wrapped around Brittany suddenly went slack, falling uselessly to her side. She looked at DeAndre, whose eyes were firmly glued to the expensive marble floor. DeAndre, my mother whispered, the absolute certainty in her voice, cracking into a million fragile pieces. What is she talking about? You told me the bank made an administrative error with your routing numbers. Let me finish the financial report. I continued, relentlessly holding the entire table hostage with the absolute devastating truth. He has been funding this fake luxury lifestyle on revolving credit for 5 long years. He maxed out his personal cards. He took out predatory loans. And when those options dried up, he went after the easiest target available. I turned to look at my sister, whose face had transformed from hysterical rage to stark, unadulterated terror. Brittany, I said, my tone lowering into a terrifying surgical calm. Did you check Trey and Mia's college savings accounts recently? The ones Mom and Dad seeded with $20,000 each when they were born? Brittany stopped breathing. She stared at me, her chest perfectly still. What she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. DeAndre drained them, I stated, driving the final lethal nail into the coffin of their perfect family narrative. He liquidated both college funds entirely 6 months ago to pay off a massive gambling debt and cover the lease on his Porsche, so he could keep playing the finance king for Mom and Dad. He completely stole your children's future to buy tailored suits and vintage champagne. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the distinct heavy sound of an entire worldview shattering upon impact. My father staggered backward, slightly bumping into a vacant chair, as the reality of his golden son-in-law completely disintegrated. The man he had proudly called the son he always wanted was a fraud, a thief, and a parasite who had plundered his own children's future to maintain a shallow facade. Brittany slowly turned her head to look at DeAndre. He did not deny it. He could not defend himself. He simply sat there, sweating, destroyed, staring at the frozen corporate card that had finally brought his empire of lies crashing down. The illusion was officially dead. The performance was completely over. My mother, realizing that the perfect life she had relentlessly praised was actually a catastrophic nightmare, began to actively hyperventilate. The social standing she valued above her own daughter's humanity was evaporating in front of New York's elite. She looked at the security guards blocking the exits. She looked at the $10,000 bill resting on the table. She realized that if DeAndre was arrested tonight, the public scandal would ruin their family name forever. The absolute desperation of the situation finally broke her. She lunged forward, grabbing my forearm with trembling, desperate hands. "Hannah, please," my mother cried, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. "You cannot let them take him away. You have the money. You own this place. Just clear the bill. Erase the charges. Please, I am begging you. He's family." I stared down at my mother's trembling hands gripping my forearm. The desperation in her touch was something I had never experienced before. For 33 years, her hands had only ever pushed me away, pointed in judgment, or waved me off as an irritating afterthought. Now she was clinging to me, as if I were a life raft in the middle of a raging ocean. She expected me to feel the familiar tug of daughterly obligation. She fully expected me to cave under the sacred banner of protecting our bloodline. I looked at her with zero emotion. The reservoir of empathy I used to carry for these people was completely and permanently dry. I gently but firmly detached her fingers from my arm, letting her hands drop back to her sides. I squared my shoulders, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life making sure I felt entirely worthless. "There is only room for 4 at this table, Mom," I said, my voice echoing with absolute unwavering finality, "and I am not one of them." My mother gasped, taking a stumbling step backward as if I had physically struck her. She looked wildly at my father, expecting him to assert his usual terrifying dominance and force me into submission. But Thomas was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public disaster unfolding around him. I turned my gaze away from my parents and looked directly at Dominic. I gave him a single sharp nod. Dominic instantly raised his hand, signaling the host stand. The heavy, polished glass doors at the front entrance of the restaurant swung open. The red and blue lights of patrol cars flashed against the dark Manhattan street outside, casting an eerie rhythmic glow across the imported marble floor of the lobby. Two uniformed police officers strode into the dining room, followed closely by a plainclothes detective holding a leather notepad. They moved with absolute undeniable purpose, cutting a direct path through the maze of silent staring patrons straight toward table 4. The entire restaurant held its collective breath. The faint clinking of silverware and the soft hum of jazz music completely vanished, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of police boots on the marble floor. The detective stepped in front of DeAndre, pulling back his jacket to display a gleaming silver badge. He did not lower his voice to protect anyone's fragile ego. DeAndre Adams, the detective stated, reading the name off the frozen corporate card still resting on the table. We received a call from the management of this establishment regarding a $10,000 theft of services, as well as an active alert from your corporate compliance department regarding suspected financial fraud. We need you to stand up and step away from the table immediately. DeAndre did not argue. He did not attempt to negotiate or flash his signature arrogant smile. The fake untouchable finance king was entirely gone. In his place sat a broken, terrified man, realizing that his house of cards had just violently imploded. He slowly pushed his chair back, his legs shaking so badly he could barely support his own weight. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked far too large for his deflating frame. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," one of the uniformed officers commanded, stepping forward with an open pair of heavy steel handcuffs. DeAndre obeyed in absolute silence. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the pristine dining room like a gunshot. It was the undeniable sound of total ruin. Seeing her husband restrained like a common criminal completely broke whatever fragile grip Brittany still held on reality. The perfectly curated illusion she had spent years projecting to her elite social circle shattered permanently. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that forced several nearby patrons to physically flinch. Brittany collapsed. Her knees hit the hard marble floor as the strength entirely abandoned her legs. Her expensive designer dress pooled around her as she sank to the ground, sobbing wildly, tearing at her perfectly styled hair. She was not crying for DeAndre. She was crying for the evaporated college funds, the impending foreclosure, and the absolute death of her social standing. She knew her wealthy friends were watching from across the room, witnessing her spectacular descent into bankruptcy and public disgrace. Her reign as the golden child was officially, disastrously over. My father, however, refused to accept defeat. Thomas watched the police begin to march DeAndre toward the exit. The reality that his favored son-in-law was being hauled away in handcuffs ignited a blinding toxic rage inside him. Unable to attack the police, he whipped around, turning his furious, bloodshot eyes directly onto me. "You did this," Thomas roared, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unhinged hatred. "You vindictive, jealous monster. You set him up to ruin this family. I am going to make you pay for this." He lunged forward. He raised his hand, fully intending to physically grab my arm, drag me out of the restaurant, and force me to fix the catastrophe he believed I had caused. He operated under the delusion that he still held the power to command me through sheer physical intimidation. He was profoundly mistaken. Before his fingers could even brush the fabric of my sleeve, two massive shadows stepped seamlessly between us. My elite private security team men, who answered exclusively to my payroll, intercepted my father with brutal, flawless precision. One guard caught my father's extended wrist, twisting it sharply downward, while the second guard stepped firmly into my father's personal space, effectively locking him in place. Thomas let out a shocked, breathless grunt as his forward momentum was instantly halted by a wall of solid muscle. "Do not touch her." The lead guard commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised immediate violence if my father resisted. Carol shrieked, clutching her face in horror as she watched her husband physically restrained. "Escort them out." I instructed my security team, my tone completely flat. "They are no longer welcome on my property." The guards did not hesitate. They spun my father around, locking his arms securely behind his back, and began marching him forcefully toward the heavy glass exit doors. My mother scrambled blindly after them, wailing in sheer pathetic disbelief as the physical removal of the parents commenced. They dragged Thomas past the host stand, his expensive leather shoes scrambling uselessly against the polished floor. He shouted empty, desperate threats over his shoulder, promising to disown me, completely blind to the fact that I had already disowned him. Carol stumbled behind them, crying out to the horrified patrons that this was all a terrible mistake, desperately trying to salvage a reputation that had already been incinerated. I stood perfectly still in the center of the dining room, breathing in the scent of fresh roses and expensive wine. I watched the heavy glass doors swing shut behind my parents, sealing them outside in the cold, unforgiving reality of the Manhattan night. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated their panicked, defeated faces one final time before the vehicles pulled away, taking DeAndre and their golden delusion with them. The toxic empire they had built was gone, swept out the front doors like common trash, leaving me standing victorious in the beautiful, peaceful quiet of my own kingdom. The silence in the dining room stretched for a few more seconds before the natural ecosystem of the obsidian corrected itself. Dominic stepped gracefully into the center of the floor, offering a polished, sweeping bow to the surrounding tables. He quietly instructed the sommelier to distribute complimentary glasses of our finest reserve champagne to the inconvenienced patrons. Within minutes, the soft hum of jazz music swelled, the clinking of heavy silver cutlery resumed, and the wealthy diners went back to their exquisite meals. The spectacle was officially over. The trash had been taken out. I turned away from the glass doors and made my way back toward the velvet-roped staircase. My security detail melted back into the shadows, their job perfectly executed. As I climbed the floating glass steps, the residual adrenaline slowly drained from my system. My heart rate settled into a steady, comforting rhythm. The heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood, the desperate need to prove my worth to people committed to misunderstanding me, completely vanished into the pristine air of the restaurant. I was no longer the discarded sister fighting for a seat at their miserable table. I was the absolute master of my own domain. I unlatched the heavy oak door of the owner's suite and stepped inside. The air in the private room was rich with the scent of dark cocoa and spun sugar. Sitting at the center of the massive marble table was my beautiful 7-year-old son. Leo was swinging his legs happily, an oversized silver spoon clutched in his small hand, as he eagerly devoured a massive custom-made chocolate soufflé. A light dusting of powdered sugar coated the tip of his nose. He looked up when I closed the door, his eyes bright and completely untouched by the ugly reality that had just unfolded downstairs. "Did Aunt Brittany leave?" Leo asked, scooping up another large bite of the warm, molten chocolate. I walked over to the table and sank into the plush leather chair across from him. I reached for my crystal glass of Pinot Noir, taking a long, savoring sip. The wine tasted like absolute victory. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, offering him a genuine, radiant smile. "Aunt Brittany and Uncle DeAndre had to go home early. They will not be joining us for dinner anymore." Leo simply shrugged, entirely unbothered by their absence. "Good," he mumbled through a mouthful of chocolate. I did not want to share my dessert anyway. I let out a soft melodic laugh. The profound beauty of his innocence struck me deeply. My son would never know the sting of my parents' conditional love. He would never be forced to shrink himself to accommodate a fragile, toxic ego. I had successfully severed the infected branches of our family tree, ensuring that Leo would grow up in a world where respect was a baseline, not a prize to be violently fought over. I took a deep breath, inhaling the absolute freedom of cutting off a poisonous family. The legal and financial fallout from that night was swift and absolutely devastating. DeAndre was formally indicted on multiple counts of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The massive $10,000 bill he attempted to run at my restaurant was just the final reckless mistake that blew his entire scheme wide open to the federal authorities. His mid-tier financial firm conducted a ruthless, sweeping audit, uncovering years of stolen funds he had actively used to finance Brittany's fake luxury lifestyle. He is currently awaiting trial and facing significant federal prison time. Brittany, entirely stripped of her designer wardrobe and her leased luxury vehicles, was forced to pack up her two children and move back into our parents' suburban house. She lost her country club membership, her elite social circle, and her carefully curated Instagram aesthetic overnight. But even that suburban sanctuary did not last long. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to save their golden son-in-law and preserve their shattered social image, Carol and Thomas completely liquidated every last cent of their retirement savings to cover DeAndre's exorbitant legal fees and his massive bail. They threw good money after bad, completely blinded by their desperate need to maintain an illusion that was already dead and buried. 6 months later, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on my parents' home. The people who had openly mocked me for wearing plain clothes and driving a practical car were now staring down total financial ruin. They tried to contact me, of course. The arrogance that once fueled their insults quickly morphed into pathetic, desperate begging. My phone blocked dozens of frantic crying voicemails from my mother demanding a bailout. She left rambling messages about how family needs to stick together during hard times entirely, forgetting that she had gladly watched me struggle for years. My father even attempted to show up at my corporate office, demanding that I fulfill my familial duties to support them. My private security team escorted him off the premises before he could even reach the reception desk.